The rain fell in a cold, merciless sheet, plastering strands of blonde hair to Amelia Vance's cheeks. She stood before the wrought iron gates of what was once her home, a place that now felt like a mausoleum of her past. Every carved leaf on the gate, every stone in the long, winding driveway, held a memory of a life that had been snatched away. She could almost hear the echoes of laughter from summer garden parties, and the ghost of her father's proud voice as he taught her about the Vance family legacy, a legacy now reduced to auction blocks and creditor notices. The world she knew, one of effortless privilege and intellectual pursuits, had evaporated in a matter of weeks, leaving only the bitter taste of ruin. A sleek black car, silent as a panther, pulled up beside her, its engine a low hum against the downpour. The rear door opened, and a man emerged, sheltered by a large black umbrella held by his driver, Julian Blackwood. He was exactly as the ruthless tabloids described him, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, with a face so handsome it was almost severe. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held no warmth as they swept over her drenched form. He was the architect of her family's destruction, the man who had torn their world apart with cold, calculated precision, and he looked at her not with triumph, but with an unnerving, profound indifference. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice as crisp and cold as the air between them, "you are late." His words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, which somehow made them cut deeper. She had been summoned to his lawyer's office an hour ago to finalize the dismemberment of her family's assets. Instead, she had come here to this ghost of a home, needing to see it one last time before the final nail was hammered into the coffin of her old life. He had found her, of course. Julian Blackwood always seemed to know exactly where to find the people whose lives he was in the process of dismantling. It was a testament to his control. He did not offer her the shelter of his umbrella. He simply weighted a statue of cold power against the gray weeping sky. Amelia straightened her back, the last embers of Vance's pride refusing to be extinguished. She would not crumble before him. She met his gaze, her own blue eyes stormy, with a grief he could never comprehend. "I needed a moment," she replied, her voice steady, despite the shivering in her limbs. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a king granting a final, meaningless request to a condemned subject. "Your moment is over," he stated, turning back toward the car. "Get in. We have business to conclude." The command was absolute, leaving no room for argument. The lawyer's office was a shrine to modern minimalism and corporate power, a glass-walled cage high above the sprawling city. Julian sat opposite her at a vast mahogany desk, the picture of calm authority, while she felt like a drenched rat caught in a trap. He gestured to a thick file, placed squarely between them. "This," he began, his voice devoid of emotion, "is a detailed accounting of your father's financial creativity. Forged documents, fraudulent loan applications, embezzlement from his own company's pension fund. The evidence is comprehensive." He slid the file across the polished surface. Amelia's hands trembled as she opened it, her blood running cold as she saw the damning, irrefutable proof of her father's desperation and deceit. She had known the business was failing, but she had never imagined this level of criminality. Her father, a man she had always seen as proud and honorable, was exposed in these pages as a common thief. Julian watched her, his expression unreadable, letting the weight of the truth crush her. "With this evidence," he continued smoothly, "the district attorney will not only ensure a conviction, they will make an example of him. He is looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal prison. A man his age and his fragile health, it is unlikely he would survive the full term." The threat was unspoken, but hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Then he pushed a second, much slimmer file toward her. It was bound in black leather, stark and simple. "However," he said, a flicker of something that might have been interest in his cold eyes, "I am prepared to be lenient. I have a proposition for you." Amelia looked from the evidence that would cage her father to the new file that represented an unknown but surely terrible alternative. She felt the last of her strength drain away, leaving her hollow. She was no longer a daughter or an heiress. She was a pawn in a game whose rules were being written by the man who had already declared checkmate. "This is an employment contract," Julian explained, tapping a manicured finger on the black leather. "My personal maid unexpectedly retired. The position is vacant." Amelia stared at him, disbelief warring with horror. A maid, he wanted her Amelia Vance, who had been educated at the finest schools and groomed to take over a financial empire to serve him. The humiliation was the entire point. It was a punishment more exquisite than any prison sentence for her father. You will live at Blackwood Manor. You will attend to my personal needs, serving my meals, maintaining my private chambers, and being available whenever I require. You will be a servant. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. In exchange for your service, this evidence, he gestured to the first file, will remain in my possession, unseen by any legal authority. Your father will remain a free man. The debt your family owes me will not be forgiven, but it will be worked off. Through your absolute obedience, the terms were cruel, designed to strip her of her name, her pride, and her very identity. He was not just taking her freedom, he was taking her past and her future, grinding them into dust under his heel. The choice was simple yet impossible, her father's life or her own soul. Amelia's mind raced, searching for an escape that did not exist. Every door was closed, every path blocked by the mountain of debt and disgrace her father had created. Julian had cornered her perfectly. To refuse was to condemn her father, a man already broken by his failure. To accept was to surrender everything she was. She thought of her mother's heartbroken face, her father's vacant eyes. Her pride felt like a pointless luxury in the face of their suffering. A cold, hard resolve settled in her chest, extinguishing the last flicker of defiance. She would endure. She would survive this. For them, she lifted her chin, her gaze, meeting his across the vast desk. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a chilling calm. I accept, she said, her voice, a mere whisper, yet it echoed in the silent room like a death sentence. A flicker of surprise, or perhaps respect, crossed Julian's features before being suppressed. He had expected tears, pleading a dramatic outburst. He had not expected this quiet, dignified surrender. He pushed a pen towards her. With a steady hand, she signed her name, the elegant script, a final reminder of the woman she used to be. The moment the ink dried, she was no longer Amelia Vance. She was his property. The transition was swift and brutal. There was no time to go home, no chance to say goodbye. She was escorted from the lawyer's office directly to Blackwood Manor. The estate was a Gothic masterpiece of granite and glass, perched on a cliff overlooking the turbulent ocean. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly without warmth. High walls and state-of-the-art security systems turned the beautiful grounds into a prison yard. As she stepped out of the car, the salty air felt heavy, and the grand entrance loomed over her like the mouth of a beast ready to swallow her whole. This was her gilded cage, and the bars were already closing around her. She was met at the door, not by Julian, but by a stern, hawk-faced woman in a crisp black dress. I am Mrs. Davenport, the head housekeeper, the woman announced, her eyes raking over Amelia's designer dress with undisguised contempt. You will address me as such. She led Amelia through a grand hall with soaring ceilings and cold marble floors, past priceless works of art and antique furniture that seemed to mock her fallen status. The silence in the manor was profound, broken only by the click of their heels on the floor. It was the silence of a place that was a house but not a home. Mrs. Davenport handed her a bundle of gray fabric, a simple, shapeless maid's uniform. Change into this, she commanded. Your old clothes will be disposed of. Your duties begin immediately. The master dislikes tardiness. The final act of humiliation was complete. Stripped of her name and her clothes, she was being remade into a servant. The uniform felt coarse and foreign against her skin, a constant physical reminder of her new station in life. Her life, as Amelia Vance, was officially over. A new bleak chapter had begun, and she had no idea how she would survive it. Her new quarters were in the servants' wing, a world away from the lavish guest suites she had glimpsed. The room was small, clean, and stark, containing only a narrow bed, a small wardrobe, and a single window that overlooked a stone courtyard. It was a cell, albeit a comfortable one. She stood in the center of the room, the gray uniform feeling like a shroud. The sheer scale of what she had done, the life she had signed away, washed over her in a suffocating wave. Yet as she looked out at the imposing architecture of her prison, a tiny defiant spark ignited within her. He could take her name, her home, and her freedom, but he could not take her mind. She would endure. She would watch, she would learn, and she would find a way to uncover the truth. The days at Blackwood Manor bled into one another, each a meticulous copy of the last, governed by the silent ticking of unseen clocks and the sharp, critical gaze of Mrs. Davenport. Amelia's life became a series of repetitive, humbling tasks. She woke before dawn, the sky still a bruised purple to dust furniture that was already spotless and polished silver that already gleamed. She learned the geography of the vast silent mansion, not as a resident but as a ghost, a phantom tasked with erasing any trace of human presence, including her own. Mrs. Davenport was her ever-present shadow, her voice a constant drizzle of criticism, finding fault in every folded napkin and polished wineglass. Amelia accepted the corrections with a quiet nod and a bowed head, her submission so complete it seemed to confirm every assumption made about her. The staff whispered that the former heiress was truly broken, a hollow shell of the vibrant woman whose picture had once graced society pages. They saw her vacant eyes and mistaken compliance for defeat. They did not see the sharp, analytical mind working tirelessly behind that placid facade, a mind that was cataloging every detail, every routine, every whisper. She was not broken, she was dormant, a predator, learning the rhythms of a new jungle before beginning her hunt. Her nights were her own stolen hours of precious solitude. The manor at night was a different beast, a place of deep shadows and echoing silence. Julian Blackwood remained confined to his private wing, a monarch in self-imposed exile, leaving the rest of the vast estate largely empty. This was when Amelia began her true work. Her primary target was the grand two-story library, a treasure trove of knowledge that had been her father's greatest envy. During her daily cleaning duties, she meticulously memorized the layout, not just of the books, but of the security systems, the subtle pressure plates near the rarest collections, the laser grids active after midnight, and the blind spots, the ceiling-mounted cameras. Her investigation did not begin with a computer. She knew that any digital activity would be monitored by Julian's formidable security team. Instead, she started with paper and ink, the forgotten relics of a bygone era of espionage. While dusting a large reading table, she accidentally knocked over a carefully stacked pile of financial journals and newspapers from the past several months. In the ensuing flurry of apologies to a scowling Mrs. Davenport, she quickly scanned the headlines and front pages, her mind, a high-speed processor absorbing dates, company names, and market trends. It was a chaotic mess of information, but chaos was where patterns could be found. In her haste to reorder the pile, she slipped one specific edition of the Wall Street Journal into the bottom of the stack. Later that night, feigning the need to repolish the table she had supposedly made a mess of, she returned to the library. With practiced ease, she located the newspaper and carefully folded the relevant page into her uniform pocket. Back in the stark safety of her small room, she unfolded the page. The article detailed a promising clean energy partnership between Vance Industries and Marcus Thorne's company, Thorne Global. It was announced with great fanfare, only to be inexplicably canceled just 2 weeks later, an event that triggered the final fatal stock slide for her father's company. The official story, the one Julian Blackwood's lawyers had presented, was that her father's mismanagement had made the partnership untenable. But Amelia knew her father's passion for that project. He saw it as the future of his company, his legacy. He would never have abandoned it without a fight. This cancellation was the first loose thread in the tightly woven narrative of her family's guilt. It was a discrepancy, a small tear in the fabric of the official story, and she knew she had to pull on it until the entire deception unraveled. This was not just mismanagement, it was sabotage. Her interactions with Julian remained as cold and sparse as the manor's decor. She served his solitary meals in a small private dining room adjoining his study. He never acknowledged her presence beyond a clipped order, his eyes always fixed on the tablet or documents before him. He was a machine of relentless efficiency fueled by black coffee, and it seemed a deep-seated anger at the world. Amelia was simply another cog in that machine, one tasked with delivering fuel and then disappearing. It was during one of these silent, tense dinners that she saw it. As he swiped through a document on his tablet, a name flashed on the screen for a fraction of a second. Thorne Global. The connection was now undeniable. Julian was not just the predator who had devoured her family's company after it faltered. He was actively involved with the very man whose actions had precipitated the fall. The game was more complex than she had imagined. Was Julian a partner of Thorne's or a rival who had simply capitalized on the chaos Thorne created? The question burned in her mind, adding a new layer of urgency to her secret investigation. She had to understand the relationship between the two men. It was the key to understanding who had truly destroyed her father. Her hidden competence began to manifest in small, subtle ways. The library, once a testament to disorganized genius, slowly began to find its order under her care. During her cleaning duties, she didn't just dust the books, she read their spines. She began to categorize them not by the arbitrary system the staff used, but by a complex cross-reference system of subject, author, and publication date. Books on corporate law were now next to texts on market ethics. Biographies of ruthless tycoons were placed alongside studies of their greatest failures. It was an intellectual puzzle she solved in plain sight. One evening, Julian stormed into the library in a rare display of frustration, searching for an obscure treatise on hostile takeover strategies he hadn't seen in years. He moved towards the section where he vaguely remembered seeing it last, only to find it gone. He was about to roar for the housekeeper when his eyes caught the spine of the book sitting exactly where it should be in the section on corporate warfare. He paused, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. He simply assumed one of the staff had finally done their job properly, never once suspecting that the foolish maid who served his coffee was the one who had organized his arsenal of knowledge. Late that night, long after the great house had fallen into its nightly slumber, Amelia sat on the floor of her small room. The only light came from a sliver of moonlight filtering through her window. The stolen newspaper page lay beside her on the cold floor. In a small notebook taken from a library supply closet, she sketched out a complex diagram. In the center, she wrote her father's name. Branching out from it were two other names, Julian Blackwood and Marcus Thorne. She drew lines between the arrows indicating money, influence, and now a canceled partnership. It was a map of her own personal war, a declaration that even though she wore a servant's uniform, the mind of Amelia Vance was still very much in the fight. Julian Blackwood's world was one of shadows, not by choice but by necessity. His nights were a barren wasteland, a territory he navigated alone, haunted by ghosts that wore the faces of his family. Sleep for him was not a sanctuary but a battlefield. He would lie in his vast cold bed, the silence of the room amplifying the roar of his own mind. The screech of tires on wet asphalt, the scent of rain and gasoline, the crystalline sound of a windshield shattering into 1,000 diamonds. These were the lullabies that kept him wide awake, his body rigid with a tension that never eased. Doctors had offered him pills, therapies, and empty platitudes, but none could silence the echoes of the crash that had stolen his family and scarred his face. This nightly torment bled into his days, poisoning his work and his temper. The legendary focus of the Blackwood Industries CEO, a focus that could dissect a hostile merger or anticipate market fluctuations with surgical precision, was now frayed and fractured. He would find himself staring at complex data streams, the numbers blurring into meaningless symbols. His empire, built on a foundation of absolute control, was being threatened by the one thing he could not command: his own mind. This powerlessness fueled a cold, simmering rage that he unleashed on his unfortunate subordinates. The staff at the manor learned to read the deepening lines of exhaustion around his eyes and walk on eggshells, terrified of the explosive anger that could be triggered by the slightest misstep. One particular evening, the pressure reached a breaking point. He was engaged in a tense video conference with his board of directors in Tokyo, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition hanging in the balance. The Japanese executives were cautious, their questions sharp and probing. Julian, running on less than an hour of fragmented sleep from the night before, felt his patience fraying into nothing. He was sharp, dismissive, and arrogant, his exhaustion manifesting as pure aggression. He bulldozed his way through the negotiations, but his arguments lacked their usual finesse. He saw the flicker of doubt in the chairman's eyes. The deal was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it was his own fault. He ended the call with a curt dismissal, the faces of the disappointed board members vanishing from the screen. He swept the papers from his desk in a rare display of violent frustration, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of his private wing. Sleep was impossible. Work was impossible. He was a king trapped in a crumbling castle of his own making. Prowling his gilded cage, he left his wing and wandered the darkened, silent halls of the manor, a tormented specter in his own home. He didn't know where he was going. He was simply moving, trying to outrun the demons that paced alongside him in the shadows. His aimless wandering eventually led him to the grand library. The room was dark, save for a single low-wattage lamp that cast a warm, golden glow on a small reading nook. Curled in one of the large leather armchairs was a figure. It was Amelia. She had evidently been tasked with polishing the intricate silver inlays of the bookshelves, a tedious late-night chore. A soft cloth lay in her lap, her work unfinished. She had fallen asleep, her head tilted against the plush velvet, her breathing soft and even. Her face, free from the tension and fear she wore during the day, looked younger, almost peaceful. Julian's first instinct was a surge of cold fury. A servant sleeping on the job in his private library. It was a flagrant breach of discipline. He moved forward, his hand raised to shake her awake, a harsh reprimand already forming on his lips. But as he drew closer, a strange phenomenon occurred. The relentless high-pitched scream of his own thoughts, the constant background noise of his trauma began to fade. The crushing weight on his chest, the feeling of a band of steel tightening around his skull started to lessen. He stopped, standing a few feet from her chair, utterly bewildered. It was her presence. The soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing was a gentle counterpoint to the chaotic symphony in his head. The air around her seemed different, imbued with a quiet stillness that felt like a physical balm. It was an impossible, illogical sensation, but it was undeniable. The closer he stood to her, the quieter his own mind became. The demons that had chased him through the halls seemed to hesitate at the edge of the warm lamplight, unwilling or unable to enter this small circle of peace she had unknowingly created. He felt a profound sense of calm he had not experienced in over a decade. He didn't understand it, but he was desperate enough not to question it. The urge to wake her, to punish her, evaporated. All he wanted was for this bizarre, miraculous quiet to last a little longer. Instead of retreating, he found himself sinking into the matching armchair opposite hers, the worn leather sighing under his weight. He told himself he would just rest his eyes for a moment, that he was merely observing this strange anomaly. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, focused on the sound of her soft breaths, and let the silence wash over him. Then, for the first time since he was a boy, Julian Blackwood fell asleep without a fight. It was not a deep, restorative slumber, but a fragile, dreamless doze, a state of rest he had thought was lost to him forever. He floated in a calm, gray void, free from nightmares and memories. He slept for what felt like a blissful eternity, but when he awoke, the first pale gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the library's tall arched windows. He felt a moment of profound disorientation, followed by the staggering realization of what had occurred. He had slept. For nearly 2 hours, he had known a peace that had been stolen from him years ago. He looked across at Amelia, who was still sound asleep, completely oblivious to the unwitting miracle she had performed. As the light grew stronger, she began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, then widened in horror as she saw him sitting there watching her. She shot out of the chair as if it were on fire, her face a mask of pure panic. "Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. I just sat down for a moment. Please forgive me," she stammered, her words tumbling over one another, expecting a furious outburst, perhaps even dismissal. But Julian remained silent. He didn't move. He simply stared at her, his mind now clear and sharp after its brief respite, working with terrifying clarity. He wasn't angry. He was a strategist facing a problem, and he had just stumbled upon the most bizarre and illogical solution imaginable. He looked at Amelia, no longer seeing the daughter of his enemy or a clumsy servant. He saw a key, a potential cure. A desperate, cruel, and brilliant idea began to take root in the cold, calculating depths of his mind. He had found a way to command sleep, and he would not let it go. The following morning, a strange and unsettling quiet descended upon Blackwood Manor. Amelia went about her duties with a sense of impending doom, expecting at any moment to be summoned and dismissed for her dereliction of duty. She braced herself for Mrs. Davenport's triumphant sneer and the cold finality of Julian's judgment. Yet the summons never came. Instead, she found herself the subject of intense, furtive glances from her employer. During his silent breakfast, his eyes, usually fixed on his tablet, would lift for a fraction of a second to study her, a look of cold, analytical curiosity in their depths. It was not the gaze of a master about to punish a servant. It was the look of a scientist observing an inexplicable specimen. Julian was a man who trusted data, not miracles. The single instance of rest in the library was an anomaly, a single data point that required verification before any conclusion could be drawn. He needed to test his hypothesis under controlled conditions. That evening, he instructed Mrs. Davenport to have Amelia organize the extensive collection of first edition novels in his formal study, a task that would take her well into the night. He then entered the room armed with a stack of financial reports and settled into his large leather desk chair, pretending to work. He was creating the same conditions as the night before, her quiet, unassuming presence in the same room. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on the columns of numbers before him. He could hear the soft rustle of her uniform, the gentle thud of a book being placed on a shelf. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the familiar tension in his shoulders began to recede. The constant high-frequency hum of anxiety in his mind started to quiet down, replaced by a sense of deep-focused calm. The numbers on the page sharpened, and his thoughts, usually fragmented and chaotic, became clear and linear. The effect was real. It was repeatable. She was not a fluke. She was a formula. And Julian Blackwood was a man who knew what to do with a valuable asset. The next day, the summons finally came. Amelia was escorted by a visibly confused Mrs. Davenport to the formal study, the same room where he had conducted his silent experiment. Julian stood by the large window, a dark silhouette against the gray afternoon light. He did not ask her to sit. He turned to face her, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. "Your duties are being revised," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "There is an addition to your nightly tasks. It is effective immediately and is a non-negotiable condition of your continued employment and my continued discretion regarding your father's affairs." He let the threat hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "From tonight, your final task of the day will be to remain in my bedchamber. You will take a seat in the armchair by the window." He paused, his gaze boring into her, daring her to show any sign of defiance. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not move from the chair. You will simply remain there in silence until I am asleep. Once I am asleep, you may quietly see yourself out. Is that understood?" It was the most monstrous, humiliating command she could have imagined, delivered with the casual indifference of a man ordering a change in the evening's menu. A wave of hot shame washed over Amelia, so intense it made her dizzy. He was ordering her into his bedroom, the most private of spaces, to be a silent spectator to his slumber. It was a violation far more intimate than any physical demand, a psychological torment designed to remind her that she was nothing more than an object, a tool, to be used for his comfort. Her every instinct screamed at her to refuse to throw the words back in his cruel, handsome face. But the image of her father, frail and defeated in a prison cell, rose in her mind. Her pride was a luxury she could not afford. She forced the fire in her throat down, transforming it into ice. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice a clipped, emotionless whisper. The first night was an exercise in pure agony. Mrs. Davenport, her face a mask of scandalized disapproval, led Amelia to the master suite in the West Wing. The room was vast and stark, decorated in shades of charcoal black and chrome. It was the lair of a deeply solitary man, a place of immense wealth and profound loneliness. A single armchair sat in the corner by a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a stunning panoramic view of the stormy ocean below. It felt like a throne for a warden, and she was the prisoner on display. She sat her back ramrod straight, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, and waited. Julian entered a few moments later, acting as though she were nothing more than a new piece of furniture. He did not look at her. He went about his nightly routine with a chilling detachment, removing his watch and cufflinks and placing them on the polished dresser. He changed out of his suit into a simple black t-shirt and trousers in an adjoining dressing room. He then sat on the edge of the massive bed, not to sleep, but to read through a thick legal document, his face illuminated by the cool glow of a bedside lamp. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick with tension and her own silent, burning humiliation. Amelia kept her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, trying to mentally transport herself away from the suffocating intimacy of the room. She could hear the soft rustle of the pages as he turned them, the almost inaudible sound of his breathing. For him, this was a clinical, pragmatic solution to a biological problem. For her, it was a slow, deliberate erosion of her soul. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. Her every breath monitored her presence, reduced to a mere variable in his cruel experiment. She steeled herself, focusing on the rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffs outside, using the sound as an anchor in a sea of degradation. Slowly, she could feel a change in the room's atmosphere. The tense energy radiating from Julian began to subside. The rigid set of his shoulders relaxed. The pace at which he turned the pages of his document slowed. After what felt like an eternity, he placed the document on his nightstand, switched off the lamp, and lay down his back to her. The room was now plunged into near total darkness, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Amelia remained perfectly still, a statue in the corner, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She listened to his breathing, waiting for it to deepen into the steady cadence of sleep. The minutes stretched into an hour. The house was utterly silent around them. Then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound from the bed. It was a name mumbled in the depths of a dream. Eleanor. The name was spoken with such a profound sense of loss and sorrow that it struck Amelia with the force of a physical blow. It was a single crack in his impenetrable armor, a glimpse of the wounded man hidden beneath the layers of cruelty and control. For the first time, she saw him not as a monster but as a fellow prisoner of his own past. Soon after, his breathing finally settled into the deep, even rhythm of genuine sleep. The tyrant was vanquished for now. Her duty was done. With the stealth of a thief, Amelia rose from the chair, her limbs stiff and cold. She slipped out of the room, closing the heavy door behind her without a sound. As she walked the long, dark corridor back to the servants' wing, a strange and unsettling feeling settled over her. The humiliation and anger were still there, but they were now mingled with something else, a flicker of power. She had just witnessed her captor at his most vulnerable. This unspoken contract had shifted the balance between them in a way she could not yet comprehend. She was no longer just his maid. She was the keeper of his peace, the guardian of his demons. The nightly ritual settled into a strange, unspoken routine. Each evening at precisely 10 o'clock, Amelia would present herself at the door of Julian's private suite. She would enter the vast, silent bedchamber and take her place in the corner armchair, a ghost sworn to a silent vigil. The initial burning humiliation began to cool into a kind of detached professionalism. She was an observer, a researcher, studying a complex and dangerous subject. She built a wall within her mind, treating these hours not as personal degradation, but as part of her larger mission to understand the man who held her family's fate in his hands. In the depths of his medicinally induced sleep, Julian Blackwood was no longer a tyrant. He was a man haunted. The whispers began on the third night. At first, they were just fragmented sounds, but as the nights wore on, they coalesced into words, names, and broken phrases. Eleanor. The rain. I couldn't see. He would murmur, his body tense, even in sleep. Not my fault. The breaks. Each whispered confession was a piece of a tragic puzzle, a glimpse into the trauma that had forged him into the cold, ruthless man he was. Amelia sat in the darkness, the unwilling priestess in his nightly confessional, and felt the first cracks appear in the armor of her own hatred. She learned that Eleanor was his younger sister, lost in the same crash that had taken his parents and scarred his face. The guilt he carried was a palpable entity in the silent room, a weight that seemed to press down on the very air she breathed. His nightmares were not about corporate takeovers or market failures. They were of a single, terrible night of rain and shattering glass. Hearing his pain night after night began a slow, subtle transformation within her. He was still her captor, the architect of her current misery, but he was no longer a one-dimensional monster. He was a man drowning in a past he could not escape. This newfound complicated perspective did not deter her from her own mission. If anything, it fueled her resolve to uncover the whole truth. An opportunity presented itself in the form of a violent thunderstorm that battered the coast one Tuesday evening. The storm knocked out a secondary power grid, causing a momentary panic among the staff as backup generators kicked in and security systems rebooted. In the brief, chaotic window of confusion, while Mrs. Davenport was shrieking orders about potential water leaks, Amelia slipped away. Her destination was the main study, a room she was normally only allowed to dust under strict supervision. The computer on the large mahogany desk was her target. She knew she had minutes at most. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her movements swift and economical. She ignored the standard search engines, knowing they would be tracked. Instead, she navigated directly to the deep web archives of several exclusive financial data services using login credentials she had memorized from her father's old files. Bypassing the security protocols was trivial. She was not just a prodigy of finance. She had a natural, intuitive understanding of system architecture. She was a ghost in the machine, moving through firewalls and data encryption with practiced ease, searching for the truth hidden in the digital ledger of the past. Her search was focused: Vance Industries stock trades the 2 weeks surrounding the cancellation of the Thorne Global Partnership. The data that loaded onto the screen confirmed her darkest suspicions. It was not a natural market slide, it was a massacre. She found a clear, undeniable pattern of aggressive short selling, a massive bet that her father's company would fail. The trades were executed with brutal precision, timed perfectly to exploit the negative press from the canceled deal. This was not just capitalizing on misfortune. This was a coordinated predatory attack designed to bleed the company dry and drive its stock price into the ground. The trades originated from a complex web of offshore shell corporations designed to be completely anonymous. It was a digital fortress of untraceability, but the architect of this fortress had made one small mistake: they had left a signature. In the way the trades were structured and the specific algorithms used to time the sales, there was a pattern, a style as unique as a painter's brushstroke. Amelia had seen it before. She had studied it during her time at university. It was the high-risk, ruthlessly aggressive signature of one man, Marcus Thorne. He hadn't just walked away from her father, he had stabbed him in the back while doing so. This discovery opened a new, even more disturbing line of questioning. If Thorne was the one who engineered the collapse, what was Julian's role? Was he a partner or something else? Amelia's fingers flew again, her search shifting from her own family's company to Blackwood Industries. She dug into their financial reports from the same period. On the surface, everything was perfect, but she looked deeper into the supply chain reports and subsidiary holdings. There she found it. In the week leading up to his hostile takeover of Vance Industries, Julian's most crucial rare earth mineral supplier had suddenly defaulted on their contract, threatening to halt production at his most profitable division. Acquiring her father's company with its stable and secure supply lines hadn't just been an act of opportunistic revenge. It had been a desperate defensive move to save his own empire from a sudden, inexplicable crisis. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place as she investigated the defaulting supplier. Just 1 month before the default, the small family-owned mining company had been quietly acquired by a holding firm. A holding firm that, through 3 more layers of corporate obfuscation, was wholly owned by another shell corporation. A shell corporation controlled by Marcus Thorne. Amelia pushed back from the desk, her heart pounding with the enormity of her discovery. It was a perfect diabolical scheme. Thorne had played them against each other like pieces on a chessboard. He had created a crisis for Julian, forcing him into a corner where a hostile takeover was his only logical move. Simultaneously, he had sabotaged her father's company, making it the perfect vulnerable target. He had made them enemies, letting one destroy the other, all while he profited from the chaos and positioned himself to pick up the pieces. Julian wasn't the king in this game. He was just the castle, the powerful piece used to capture the pawn. The storm outside began to subside as she slipped out of the study, leaving no trace of her presence. She walked back to her small room, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The pure, righteous hatred she had harbored for Julian Blackwood was now gone, replaced by a complex and unsettling mix of pity and understanding. That night, as she took her place in the armchair in his room, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. When she heard him whisper his sister's name in the dark, she no longer saw her tormentor. She saw a fellow victim, another casualty of the real monster who still lurked in the shadows. The truth was a weapon, and Amelia spent the next day sharpening its edge. She knew that confronting Julian Blackwood required more than just accusations. It demanded irrefutable proof, presented in a language he could not dismiss. She needed to choose her moment carefully, a moment when his guard was down, when the cracks in his armor were most visible. She observed him during his solitary breakfast, noting the deep-set exhaustion in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his coffee cup. His insomnia was clearly taking its toll, making him more volatile, but also, perhaps, more susceptible to a truth he did not want to hear. She made her move that afternoon. Bypassing a startled Mrs. Davenport, Amelia walked directly to the door of his formal study and knocked her knuckles, rapping sharply against the dark oak. The command to enter was a low growl of annoyance. Julian was at his desk, surrounded by stacks of reports, his face a mask of irritation. "What is it?" he snapped, not bothering to look up. "If the silver isn't polished to your satisfaction, Mrs. Davenport can handle your complaints." His words were designed to put her back in her place, to remind her of her lowly status. Amelia ignored the jibe. She walked forward and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. On it, she had written a timeline, clear and concise. On one side were the events leading to the collapse of Vance Industries, the announcement of the Thorne partnership, its abrupt cancellation, the aggressive short-selling. On the other side was a parallel timeline for Blackwood Industries, the sudden default of his key mineral supplier, the subsequent supply chain crisis, and the hostile takeover of her father's assets. "This was not a series of unfortunate events," she said, her voice steady and cold. "This was a coordinated attack, and we were not enemies, we were targets." Julian finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and arrogant contempt. "This is a pathetic and rather inventive attempt to absolve your father of his crimes." Did you spend all night concocting this fantasy instead of doing your chores? He leaned back in his chair, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Your father was a fool who mismanaged his company into the ground. I simply collected on his debt. Marcus Thorne was smart enough to get out before it all went under. That is the simple, boring truth. Now get out. Amelia did not move. She had expected this, his prideful, arrogant dismissal. You're right, she said calmly. My father made mistakes. He was too trusting. But his greatest mistake was doing business with a man who was simultaneously planning his ruin. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the polished desk, and recited a 16-digit number from memory. That is the account number for a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, Ethelred Holdings. It's the source of the funds used to short sell my father's stock. I imagine you recognize it. Julian's smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden deathly stillness. His eyes narrowed, the casual contempt instantly replaced by a sharp, dangerous focus. That account number. It was not public information. In fact, it was a piece of data from his own highly confidential investigation into the supplier who had defaulted on him. Ethelred Holdings was the same phantom entity that had acquired the mining company just before it had mysteriously breached its contract with him. He had hit a dead end trying to trace its ownership for months. And now this girl, his maid, was reciting its number to him as if it were a line of poetry. Without a word, he turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that betrayed his inner turmoil. He pulled up his own encrypted files, his personal investigation into the supply chain crisis. He cross-referenced the account number, his screen filling with the same web of shell corporations and untraceable transactions that she must have somehow navigated. Everything she had said was true. The timelines matched. The methods matched. He had been so consumed by his preconceived narrative of Vance's incompetence and his own quest for revenge that he had failed to see the larger pattern. He, Julian Blackwood, the master of the game, had been a pawn. Marcus Thorne, a man he had always dismissed as a flashy but ultimately harmless rival, had played him perfectly. Thorne had created a crisis for him, then served up the perfect, desperate solution on a silver platter, the assets of his weakened enemy, the Vance family. He had been a weapon in Thorne's hand, aimed and fired at Thorne's true target. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. His anger, once a cold, steady flame directed at the Vances, now roared into an inferno, seeking a new and deserving target. He leaned back the leather of his chair, groaning in the silent room. He looked at Amelia, truly looked at her for the first time. The drab uniform, the bowed head, it was all a disguise. Behind the facade of a fallen heiress was a mind as sharp and analytical as his own, perhaps even sharper. She had seen the pattern that his own team of high-paid experts had missed. How, he asked, his voice a low whisper stripped of its usual arrogance. It was a genuine question, an admission of her superior intellect. It was a surrender. My father taught me to read the story that numbers tell, she replied simply, and these numbers tell a story of betrayal. The dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the master, and she was no longer the servant. They were two survivors of the same shipwreck, staring at the shark that had sunk their vessels. Marcus Thorne is still out there, she continued, pressing her advantage. He tried to destroy both of our families. The question is, she met his gaze, her eyes now gleaming with a cold fire. He recognized in himself, what are we going to do about it? That night, the ritual in his bedchamber was transformed. When Amelia entered, she found that the humiliating servant's chair in the corner was gone. Julian was sitting in one of the two large armchairs by the window, gesturing for her to take the other. The vast space between them, once a chasm of power and servitude, was now a neutral ground. Thorne's greatest weakness is his vanity, Julian began, his voice low and conspiratorial in the dim light. He's hosting his annual Blackwood Gala in 3 weeks. He sees it as the ultimate symbol of his impending victory over me. Amelia listened, her mind already racing. A gala, she mused. A public stage. The perfect place for a public execution. For the first time since she had entered this house, she did not feel like a prisoner. As they sat in the darkness, the storm raging over the ocean outside, they began to plot. The bedroom, once a chamber of humiliation for her and a desperate necessity for him, had become their war room. An unspoken contract of servitude had been replaced by a fragile truce, a dangerous alliance, forged in the fires of a shared desire for revenge. The dawn that followed their fragile truce brought with it a seismic shift in the power dynamics of Blackwood Manor. Julian, a man who never explained himself, issued a single stunning directive to a bewildered Mrs. Davenport. From this moment on, he stated his voice, leaving no room for argument. Miss Vance is no longer a member of the domestic staff. She is a consultant, a strategic advisor. She is to be granted unrestricted access to the library, the study, and all necessary resources. You will treat her with the respect befitting that position. The head housekeeper's face was a mask of disbelief, but she understood a direct order. The whispers among the staff now changed from contempt to awestruck confusion. Amelia was moved from her small room in the servants' wing to a lavish guest suite in the main hall, her drab gray uniform replaced by a wardrobe of elegant professional attire, selected by Julian's personal shopper. The transformation was not just external. With the restoration of her status came the return of her confidence. When she walked into the formal study that morning, she was not the meek, defeated girl who had entered the house weeks ago. She was Amelia Vance, her mind sharp and her purpose clear. The room, once a symbol of her family's humiliation, had now become her battlefield. Julian had already assembled a small elite team of his most trusted financial analysts and legal experts. They were the inner circle, the only ones he trusted with the crisis threatening his company. When Amelia entered, they looked at her with polite skepticism. They saw a young, beautiful woman, not a strategic mastermind. Julian made the introductions simply. "This is Miss Vance," he said. "She has a unique perspective on our current problem. You will give her your full cooperation." The team's skepticism was palpable, but they held their tongues out of loyalty to their employer. It was Amelia who shattered their doubts. Julian presented the problem, a complex web of shell corporations that was creating instability in his supply chain and subtly manipulating his stock price. His team had been trying to untangle it for weeks. Amelia walked to the large digital whiteboard, picked up a stylus, and in less than an hour she had mapped out the entire network. She didn't just use the data they had. She used her intimate knowledge of Marcus Thorne's psychological profile, his arrogance, his preferred methods, his financial blind spots. She connected entities his team had dismissed as unrelated, predicting Thorne's moves with uncanny accuracy. The analysts watched their skepticism melting into pure astonishment. She moved with a fluid, confident grace, her voice clear and authoritative, as she explained the intricate financial maneuvers Thorne was using. She was not just analyzing data. She was telling a story, the story of a corporate predator stalking his prey. By the end of her presentation, the room was silent. She had earned their respect not through Julian's command, but through her own undeniable brilliance. Julian watched from the side, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring within him. It was pride, not in his own company, but in her. Their days became a whirlwind of intense, focused work. Their nights in his bedchamber, once a ritual of humiliation, were now an extension of their war room. They would sit in the armchairs by the window, the stormy ocean outside mirroring the turbulence of their task, and strategize in low, hushed tones. They became a seamless unit. He was the hammer, using his immense resources to launch aggressive investigations and apply pressure on Thorne's allies. She was the scalpel, directing that raw power with precision, using the intelligence he gathered to cut through Thorne's deceptions and expose the core of his plan. Their combined investigation revealed a scheme far more audacious than they had imagined. Marcus Thorne didn't just want to wound them, he wanted to consume them. They discovered evidence that he was secretly orchestrating a massive hostile takeover. His plan was to use the upcoming Blackwood Gala as his stage. He would leak fabricated evidence of a fatal weakness in Blackwood Industries, while simultaneously triggering a final crushing blow to the remnants of the Vance estate. The resulting market panic would allow his proxies to acquire controlling shares in both companies for pennies on the dollar, merging them into his own growing empire. "He wants to use my own party to announce my death," Julian said, his voice a low growl. A cold, dangerous light shone in his eyes. "Then we shall make it his funeral instead." The gala, Thorne's intended stage for their ruin, would become the centerpiece of their trap. They would not cancel it. Instead, they would lean into Thorne's narrative, feigning weakness and desperation, luring him into a false sense of security. Julian would play the part of the cornered CEO, while Amelia prepared the weapon that would deliver the killing blow. She spent days locked in the study, not as a consultant, but as the financial prodigy she had always been. She took all the evidence they had gathered, the offshore accounts, the stock manipulation records, the trail of corporate sabotage, and wove it into a single, devastating presentation. It was a digital portfolio that chronicled every crime, every betrayal, every lie. It was a masterpiece of financial forensics, an irrefutable indictment of Marcus Thorne. This presentation would be their bomb, and the gala would be their detonation site. The day before the event, a team of stylists arrived at the manor. Julian had insisted that Amelia attend the gala, not as an advisor hidden in the shadows, but at his side. As she stood before the mirror in her new suite, she saw a stranger looking back at her. The woman in the mirror was dressed in a stunning gown of midnight blue silk that shimmered like the deep ocean. Her hair was styled in an elegant chignon, and a simple string of Vance family pearls graced her neck. She was no longer a maid nor simply a consultant. She was the heiress she was born to be, but with a warrior's fire in her eyes. Julian walked in at that moment, stopping dead in the doorway. He had grown accustomed to the sharp, intelligent strategist in a simple blouse and trousers. He was not prepared for this vision of breathtaking elegance and power. He saw the woman she had been, the woman she was now, and the incredible woman she was becoming all at once. The air between them crackled with an unspoken energy, a current of attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface of their alliance for weeks. It was powerful, undeniable, and utterly terrifying to them both. He simply knotted his throat suddenly tight. "You look formidable, Miss Vance." That evening they stood together in the study, their trap meticulously set. The presentation was loaded onto a secure server ready to be deployed. The guest list for the gala was a veritable who's who of the financial world. Marcus Thorne would be there, walking into the lion's den, believing himself to be the lion. They were ready. They were a team. Julian looked at her, the memory of her in the blue gown still vivid in his mind. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and intense, "we take back everything he stole." The Blackwood Gala was the most anticipated event on the corporate calendar, a glittering affair where fortunes were made and reputations were shattered. This year, the grand ballroom of the street, Regis Hotel, buzzed with an undercurrent of predatory anticipation. The air was thick with rumors of Julian Blackwood's impending fall from grace. Titans of industry and their elegantly dressed partners gathered in small, whispering clusters, their eyes constantly darting towards the grand entrance, eager to witness the public humbling of a man they both feared and envied. They were vultures circling what they believed to be a dying lion, ready to pick the carcass clean. The whispers died into a stunned silence when the grand doors swung open. Julian Blackwood made his entrance not with the haunted, defeated air everyone expected, but with a look of cold, unwavering command. He was a king in his own court, the master of ceremonies at an event that bore his name. But the real shock was the woman on his arm. It was Amelia Vance. The high society guests who had reveled in her family's downfall just months ago now stared in open-mouthed astonishment. She was not the broken, disgraced girl they remembered. Dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk, she moved with a serene confidence that radiated an almost tangible power, her beauty eclipsed only by the fierce intelligence in her eyes. Their entrance was a declaration of war. They moved through the ballroom as a single, formidable unit, a silent challenge to the gossiping masses. Marcus Thorne, exuding an air of false sincerity, was the first to approach them, his face a perfect mask of concern. "Julian, my friend," he said, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy, "I was so sorry to hear about your recent troubles. And Amelia, my dear, it's a surprise to see you here. I trust you are being well taken care of." The condescending words were a veiled taunt, a confident predator playing with his cornered prey before the final strike. Julian played his part to perfection. He inclined his head, his expression weary. "Marcus, thank you for your concern. It has been a challenging time." Amelia offered a small, enigmatic smile, her silence more unnerving to Thorne than any sharp retort could have been. She simply watched him, her gaze analytical and calm, as if observing a particularly interesting but ultimately predictable specimen. Thorne, expecting a satisfying display of their desperation, was left feeling strangely off balance. He excused himself, his confident smirk now seeming a little too forced, a little too brittle. He had no idea the trap was already closing around him. The climax of the evening arrived with Julian's keynote address. He walked to the podium, a lone figure on the grand stage, the entire room holding its breath. He began his speech not with financial projections or corporate platitudes, but with a quiet philosophical reflection. "We build our legacies on a foundation of trust," he said, his deep voice resonating through the silent ballroom, his gaze fixed on Marcus Thorne. "But what happens when that foundation is eroded by betrayal? What happens when the numbers, the very language of our world, are manipulated to tell a story of lies?" The tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. "Tonight I was supposed to speak about the future of Blackwood Industries," Julian continued. "Instead, I want to talk about the past. Because to build a true future, we must first expose the rot that has been festering in the dark. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. To help illustrate this point, I would like to welcome to the stage a woman of extraordinary intellect and resilience who has been instrumental in uncovering a conspiracy that affects us all. My esteemed colleague, Miss Amelia Vance. A collective gasp swept through the audience. This was not the speech of a defeated man. This was the opening salvo of a counterattack. Amelia walked onto the stage with a grace and purpose that captivated every person in the room. She was no longer Julian's date, no longer a fallen heiress. She was a woman in command. As she reached the podium, the massive screens behind her, which had been displaying the Blackwood logo, flickered to life. They did not show corporate charts, but the damning presentation she had meticulously crafted. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and strong. "For the past several months, our community has been watching the tragic collapse of Vance Industries. The official narrative was one of mismanagement. Tonight, I will present you with the truth." Her presentation was a masterpiece of cold, hard facts. She calmly and methodically walked the stunned audience through Marcus Thorne's entire scheme. The web of offshore shell corporations, the illegal short-selling of her father's stock, the deliberate sabotage of Julian's supply chain, every crime was laid bare, supported by irrefutable evidence in the form of bank records, encrypted communications, and trade logs. She spoke not with the emotion of a victim, but with the dispassionate precision of a prosecutor delivering a final, unassailable argument. The ballroom was utterly silent, the only sound her clear, steady voice narrating the downfall of the man in their midst. Marcus Thorne's face had gone from a confident smirk to a mask of pale, sweating horror. He was trapped, exposed under the bright lights of the stage and the condemning stares of his peers. He half rose from his chair, a desperate denial on his lips, but no sound came out. He was a king, suddenly stripped of his robes, his treachery laid bare for the world to see. Amelia concluded her presentation with a final devastating slide, a direct wire transfer from a Thorne Global subsidiary to the offshore account that had orchestrated the entire attack. "The numbers," she said softly, "do not lie." As a heavy, shocked silence settled over the room, the grand doors of the ballroom swung open. It was not more guests, but a team of federal agents, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. They moved through the stunned crowd with a quiet purpose, their path leading directly to one table. Marcus Thorne, once a titan of industry, now looked like a cornered rat. He made a desperate attempt to flee, but Julian's private security position perfectly blocked his escape. His public execution was complete. He was quietly handcuffed and led away, his empire crumbling to dust around him. Julian stepped forward to the podium, standing beside Amelia. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, his expression grim but resolute. "Tonight," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "marks the end of an era of deceit." He then looked at Amelia, a look of profound respect and gratitude in his eyes. "It also marks the beginning of a new one. Blackwood Industries is pleased to announce the formation of the Vance Foundation, a new partnership dedicated to ethical business practices, which will be chaired by Miss Vance herself, who will oversee the full restoration of her family's legacy." They left the gala together, leaving the chaos and the frenzy of the press behind them. The external war was over. They had won. As they sat in the silent cocoon of their car, speeding away from the scene of their victory, Julian reached across the space between them and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through. The battle against their common enemy had been won, but now in the quiet aftermath, a new, more complicated chapter was just beginning. They had to figure out what came next for the two of them. The aftermath of the Blackwood Gala was a media firestorm. News outlets lauded Julian Blackwood as a corporate visionary who had masterfully exposed a dangerous criminal while simultaneously anointing Amelia Vance as a brilliant and mysterious new power player. The narrative of the fallen heiress was rewritten overnight into a tale of triumphant resurrection. Inside the quiet walls of the manor, however, the victory felt less like a grand conclusion and more like the silent, uncertain pause after a storm has passed. The enemy was gone, the world outside was cheering, but the two people at the center of it all were left to navigate the wreckage of their own complicated relationship. The next morning, Julian summoned Amelia to the formal study. It was the same room where he had first presented her with the cruel contract, a place that held the ghost of her humiliation. The contract itself lay on the center of the polished mahogany desk, a stark reminder of their journey's beginning. Julian was not seated in his usual position of power behind the desk, but was standing by the window, looking out at the calm ocean. He turned as she entered, and for the first time she saw no trace of the tyrant in his eyes, only a deep, unnerving vulnerability. He looked tired but at peace. The Vance family's assets, those that weren't liquidated, have been recovered. He began, his voice quiet and formal. The foundation I announced will give you full control to rebuild. The debt is, of course, irrelevant now. This contract is null and void. He gestured to the document on the desk. You are free, Amelia. I will provide you with whatever you need, a new identity, a home in any country you choose. You have earned your freedom and much more. You are no longer bound to me or this house. He was offering her an escape, a clean slate, a chance to walk away from the man who had been her captor. Amelia walked slowly towards the desk, her gaze fixed on the contract that had defined her existence for months. She picked up the document, the crisp paper, feeling heavy in her hands. This was her ticket out, her reward for enduring the unendurable. She could walk away, rebuild her life, and leave the shadows of Blackwood Manor behind forever. She thought of the humiliation, the cold indifference, the night spent as a silent sentinel. Then she thought of the whispered nightmares, the shared secrets in the dark, and the fierce protective partnership they had forged in the crucible of their shared crisis. She looked at Julian, who stood watching her, his expression carefully neutral, bracing himself for her departure. She saw the lonely, wounded man behind the powerful CEO, a man who had shown her his deepest scars. You once told me my father's greatest mistake was being too trusting, she said softly. I think my greatest mistake would be to walk away now. With a quiet, deliberate motion, she tore the contract in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces fall from her fingers onto the polished floor. My legacy isn't something I want to rebuild alone, Julian. It's something I want to build with you. A wave of emotion, disbelief, relief, a profound, heart-stopping hope washed over Julian's face. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just before her. Amelia, he whispered, his voice thick, with an emotion she had never heard from him before. What I did to you, it was unforgivable. I was a man driven by a ghost seeking revenge against the wrong people. I don't deserve. His voice broke. He who had never shown a moment of weakness was now laid bare before her. Those nights, you were not just a cure for my insomnia, you were a cure for my soul. You brought peace to a man who thought he would never know it again. He reached out his hand, gently cupping her cheek, his touch hesitant, as if he were afraid she might disappear. I have spent half my life hiding in the dark. You are the first person who has ever made me want to step into the light. His gaze was intense, pleading. Don't stay because you feel a sense of debt or duty. Stay because you could feel something for the man, not the monster. Stay and build a new legacy with me. Not as a consultant, not as a keeper, as my wife, my partner, my equal. It was not a command, but a question, a humble offering of his broken, healing heart. Amelia leaned into his touch, her own eyes filling with tears. The long, painful chapter of revenge and servitude was finally over. The anger and humiliation had been washed away, leaving behind a foundation of mutual respect, understanding, and a deep, unexpected affection. She had entered this house as a prisoner, but in its shadows, she had found not only the truth, but a man as lost and lonely as she was. Yes, she whispered, her voice full of certainty. Yes, Julian, I'll stay. He closed the small distance between them, and his lips met hers not with the fire of possession, but with the gentle promise of a new dawn. Epilogue, 1 year later. The boardroom buzzed with energy. At the head of the long table, Amelia Vance, poised and confident, brought the first annual meeting of the restored Vance Foundation to a close. Her father, his health returned, and his eyes bright with pride, sat to her right, a supportive presence. She was no longer a fallen heiress, but a respected chairperson, a leader in the world of ethical investment, her name once again synonymous with integrity and vision. She had not just restored her family's legacy, she had reshaped it into something stronger and more honorable than it had ever been before. That evening, she returned to Blackwood Manor. The imposing Gothic structure no longer felt like a prison, but a sanctuary. The halls, once cold and silent, were now filled with warmth, light, and the soft strains of classical music. She found Julian in the library, not hunched over financial reports, but reclining in an armchair by the fire, reading a novel. He looked up as she entered, a genuine, relaxed smile gracing his features. The haunted, sleepless tyrant was gone, replaced by a man at peace. The scars on his face remained, but they were no longer a mark of trauma, but a reminder of the survival that had led him to her. He stood and crossed to her, wrapping her in his arms. "Welcome home," he murmured against her hair. She smiled, feeling the simple, profound joy of the words. They stood together by the large window, looking out at the calm ocean, no longer two separate wounded souls, but a single unified force. The story that had begun with debt and humiliation had been rewritten, transformed by forgiveness and courage into a legacy of love. A dawn of a new legacy built not on the ruins of the past, but on the powerful promise of their shared future.